So Logic Pro has more distortion plugins than you realise. Is that true? I mean, it is the title of a YouTube video, so I guess it must be, mustn't it? To be a little bit more serious though, I think you might be surprised at how many distortion plugins there are in Logic. Now, I'm not talking about dedicated distortion plugins, but I'm talking about plugins where distortion is either a feature or an option within that plugin, or where there's a plugin that will give you the effect of adding distortion to your sound or source signal. Now, some of these might be a little bit surprising to you, and you may not have considered them to be used in this particular way. So hopefully you're going to discover a new approach to using your stock Logic plugins to add distortion in creative and exciting new ways. So we're back. I've had a few issues with my screen capture software, but hopefully that's sorted now. So I am back with another video, and this time we're talking about distortion. Now we're going to take a look at plugins in Logic that are not dedicated distortion plugins, although some of them kind of are, but plugins nonetheless that can give us some distorted effects. So we're going to take a look at what those are. Hopefully some of those are going to be a little bit surprising to you, and they might be plugins that you wouldn't have considered using in this sort of way. But I think it's interesting nonetheless, and it's always good to have options. So let's take a look. What I've done, I've just dragged in a drum loop from my cyclic sample pack. If you want to go and check that out, there's links in the description. So this is that loop. No, it's not. Here we go. There we go, so that's the loop. What I'm going to do before we do anything, I'm going to pull the gain down on this. Basically, I want a bit of headroom. If we're going to be adding distortion, some of these plugins we may be adding gain as well as just sort of harmonic distortion. And I just want to give ourselves a little bit of headroom to work with. So what are these plugins? So I'm not going to talk about the distortion plugins in the distortion category, because they're obviously distortion, and if you hadn't already guessed, I'm going to be saying distortion quite a lot in this video. I may try and switch it up and say saturation or something else along the way, but I'm probably going to be using that word a lot. So where do we begin? What I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through one by one all of the plugins where I think that you can create some kind of distortion or in some way affect the signal such that it gives us a distorted effect. Distortion in general is quite a vague term, and I'm not going to go into that here. I don't know enough about it in all honesty, so we're just going to take a look at some plugins and look at ways that we can use them to generate some distortion. That's it. So with that being said, without further ado, let's do that. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is under the amps and pedals and the amp designer. This might be obvious to you, but distorted guitar has been around for quite some time now, many decades. And these amp simulators obviously make use of make use of algorithms that mimic these sort of distorted guitar amps. And because these amp simulators also include cabinet simulation, you actually get an additional level of shaping the sound that is not necessarily included in other distortion plugins. So let's just go through some of the presets. That's all we have to do, and hit play. Some of them are going to be a lot more distorted than others. That's quite nice. Oh, I like that. What that's doing to the kick. The other thing is that we have mic options here. We can select different microphones. Not only that, but we can move them around. you know, and we've got all the normal controls that you'd expect with a guitar amp. I'm not going to go through all these. We've got crunch, we've got distorted. And obviously some of them are much more usable than others, but probably fairly obvious one there to begin with, but useful nonetheless. And there are a lot of different options to choose from. Now, if we go to the same folder, we've got the bass amp designer. Again, this might give you some distorted, it might sort of boost the low end, and if you're sort of running that into a compressor or a clipper or a limiter or something, you're going to probably get some distortion from that. I'm not going to look at that, but we are going to go to the pedal board. Now, under the pedal board, we have a whole load of pedals, distortion pedals, that give us a huge range of different distortion options. I mean, we've got fuzz pedals, different types of fuzz pedals. No end of. I mean, that one sounds like a bit crusher to me. I mean, there seriously are a lot of different. So many different options. So we've got the amp pedals. Now, again, maybe fairly obvious, but there are so many to choose from here that it's definitely worth bearing in mind that we have these as an option. Now, the next one I'm going to come to, we have delay. Now, you might think that none of the delay plugins would really be introducing any distortion, but we do have the tape delay. Now, tapes are quite well known for clipping the signal in quite a pleasing way, and so tape emulation plugins include this saturation algorithm. So in order for us to use this, we don't actually want the signal delaying. So what we need to do is unsync the tempo, and we need to bring the delay time down to 0 milliseconds. So essentially there is no delay whatsoever. Now if we play this, hopefully you can hear there what that's adding to the signal. We're obviously adding a lot of gain there. So let's just use the wet. I think you can hear the difference that that's making, just having the wet signal. There is some saturation. And now we can dial this in to taste. We can use the filter section to really shape the sound however we want. The other thing that we can do, which does take it a little bit away from distortion, but can also give us some interesting results, if you like, so it's worth just messing around with. We have like this tape head mode. If we change this to diffuse from clean, so we can get some also weird effects that you might not necessarily think of straight away when using a delay plugin like this. Now we can also get some other weird things happening. Okay, not distortion, but it's quite interesting and fun to play with anyway, so I just thought I'd show you that quickly. Okay, so there we go. We're using tape delay as distortion or saturation. Okay, what else have we got? Okay, we'll skip over the distortion plugins, as I've said. If we come to dynamics now, so we've got limiter. Now a limiter is going to clip the signal, and if we drive the signal into that limiter, it's going to clip, and it is going to effectively cut the peaks off the waveforms and give us distortion. It may not be the most pleasing musically, but it is it can be used as a way to distort a signal. So it's definitely a viable option. So it's an option. It wouldn't normally be my go-to. I would prefer to use a clipper or something else, but it's an option. And it's sometimes, if you're doing sound design, it's worth trying these things, because you never know. If you use a limiter maybe at the end of the chain with some other effects on it and then drive into that limiter, you might get some interesting results. Also under dynamics, we have the we have compressors. We have a normal compressor and the multipressor. Let's just use the normal compressor. Now this is how I have my default setup. I've changed the default. This is how I like to use it. So I normally have the distortion set to soft clipping, and I have the output mix to -1. Now again, because we've got the distortion on, which will clip the signal, we can actually drive into that and create a distorted signal. This can be really useful on bass sounds, and I'm sure this is nothing new. People use all kinds of compressors to add harmonic content, distortion. It's nothing new, but it's worth bearing in mind. And if you're sort of new to music production, you may not have thought of using a compressor in this way, so it's worth mentioning. What have we got next? So we have EQ. Now with more recent versions of Logic Pro, we have the vintage EQ collection. If we open these up, all of the vintage options have some kind of drive on the output with different algorithms. So we can actually add drive and actually add color and saturation, not just EQ. So you think you can hear the distortion there, but because it's an EQ, we can also shape the sound within the same plugin. So I think that sounds quite nice. So EQs, the vintage options that give us some drive options on the output, worth bearing in mind. What else have we got? Filter. Okay, we've got the auto filter. Let's take a look at this. Now we have a distortion unit as part of this filter, and this gives us two ways to add the distortion, shall we say. We can add it pre-filter and post-filter, and we can dial in the amount of each that we want with 3 different options as well. So let's just dial some. Now obviously we've got the cutoff set to 50%, so we could open this full range. Maybe let's say we want to cut some of the highs out. Now we've got a dry signal and a main output, so we can blend these. Now obviously we have LFOs and envelopes that we can use to change the sound, but even if we turn all of these off, we still have just pure distortion. Again, is this any better or any different to the other distortion plugins that are in Logic? My feeling is that these are probably the same algorithms that you find in other plugins in Logic, so it's not a completely unique type of distortion, but because we have these other filter options, we can in a single plugin have distortion and other effects to give us, you know, a different sound that we might not get otherwise. Worth bearing in mind once again. Also under filter, we've got the Evoc 20 filter bank. Now I really like this little plugin. I know this is old school and it's in some ways the interface and stuff could do with some modernizing the GUI, but it's quite an interesting plugin, and we can get some quite interesting distortion type effects from it. Now what I will do, I'm going to pull down the resonance because that gives us a particular kind of sound that I don't particularly want, or at least not to begin with. If we just play this, so it is changing the sound. We can change the number of bands, which will change the sound. What I tend to, if I wanted to use this to add some distortion, which is not normally the way that I would use it, but it is possible, what I would do is I'd open up these high and low shelf, low pass filters, and I would increase the boost A and the boost B. Now we do have an overdrive here. We can make use of that. But what we can do so I'm just going to pull back the output. We also have a different slope here, which gives us a different characteristic. Like I said, we can play with the number of bands. Which will change the sound, and we can use this filter And if we want to get really weird, we can use the resonance and the formant shift to really mess around with the sound. And obviously we've got the LFO. So we can get quite crazy with this plugin. That's why I like it a lot. It's very good for sound design. So not strictly a distortion, although because we're kind of boosting and it's changing the sound, it is kind of changing the waveform, adding harmonic content, which technically is distortion. And especially if we blast this into a compressor or something else, a clipper, we can get some really interesting distorted effects using it. So I think it's definitely worth including in this list. So that's the Evoc 20 filter bank. Also under the filters, let's look at the fuzz wah. Well, this is a wah, but it also has the built-in fuzz. It also has a built-in compressor. A compressor even. And we also have the wah. We can use the wah and introduce that with the fuzz and the compression as well if we choose to. So yeah, it's another option. It's another thing that we can mess around with that will give us some fuzzy, distorted signals. I don't know if I'm going to run out of room for all the plugins here. Anyway, also under filters we have the spectral gate. Now again, this one not necessarily really distortion, but in the way that it processes the signal, it does add some weird harmonic content that you could, I guess, class as distortion. Let's just play around with some of the settings and see what we can get. Okay, so I'm kind of cheating a little bit here because I'm slamming it into a compressor. But I don't think anyone would say that that's a nice clean signal. That is a distorted signal. And we can get some really weird, quite interesting results from this plugin. Yeah, so there we go. That is the spectral gate filter. What else have we got? Okay, let's jump over the imaging and metering, and we'll jump over the modulation as well. Now if we come to multi-effects, if we come to fat effects, now this you may already have thought of this when I'm talking about distortion, but this is essentially, if any of you have used Camel Crusher in the past, Logic bought Camel Crusher and then adapted that into this plugin. So Camel Crusher is contained within this plugin, and presumably that is within this distortion, compression, and possibly this bass enhancer section. So I'm going to turn off the bandpass, the filter, all these other bits and bobs. So we'll just concentrate on the distortion. Now here it gives us 3 elements of distortion, and we have a whole range of different distortion algorithms that we can select for each of these different stages of distortion. We can dial these amounts in to taste. We also have the bass enhancer, and we have a built-in compressor with all of the different Logic compressor modules, if you like. So with all these other options, this makes it a very powerful distortion plugin, probably one of the more obvious ones, so we're not going to spend too much time looking at this. But again, sometimes, you know, these things are here for us to use and we can overlook them. I've bought many other sort of third-party plugins, distortion plugins, and I do sometimes overlook what's already included in Logic, which is a bit of a shame because it's, you know, they are really useful. Right. Okay, I've sorted the dog out, so let's continue. Okay, that's Fat Effects. One more plugin that might surprise you that can technically be used as a kind of like a distortion is one of the reverbs, and that would be Space Designer. The reason that we can use Space Designer in a way to distort the signal is because it is a convolution reverb, meaning we can load in our own impulse responses. Now what that means is that we can load in something, an audio file that has a lot of sort of distorted characteristics to it, and impart some of that characteristic on the sound that we're processing. So let's load something. I actually have some guitar impulse responses, so I'm going to choose one. Let me come to, I have some sort of metal ones, so let's use these because these should be distorted. Let's Chimera, let's use a Chimera one. These might not give you the most distorted signal ever, but they, or Fear Factory, let's have some Fear Factory. They could provide something that is a bit unique and a bit unusual, and, you know, provides some additional harmonic content to your sound. So you can hear there how that's changing our sound. We can play with the settings quite a bit. And maybe we can even try using something like a noise sample. Let me load some of my, I've got some noise samples, another sample pack. I'll leave a link for in the description for this as well. Let's choose a nice tape hiss, I don't know. So that's working really nicely to distort the signal. We can get some really crazy kind of results from this. For sound design, it's definitely worth looking at and just playing around, loading in different impulse responses, different audio samples, and see what results fall out. We all know in this music production game that happy accidents is where it's at, so the more happy accidents the better. So maybe another slightly surprising one there, the Space Designer convolution reverb for getting some distorted signals. Are we done yet? We're nearly there. Okay, what else have we got? Specialized exciter. This one maybe this one's a little bit more expected. Maybe some of you were shouting at the screen saying, what about the exciter? Yeah. Yeah, it's adding harmonic excitement, harmonic content. Are we done? I think that is pretty much it. Sub bass. Let's have a look. Can we get some distortion out of using the sub bass? I don't see why not. Let's just crank the wet up and play with the settings and see if we can't distort the signal somehow. Maybe with a little bit of help from a compressor, we can get some weird distorted signals from the sub bass. Okay, I think that is about it. So how many did we end up with? I'm going to get rid of the sub bass. I'm not going to include that one. Was there another one that was a bit... I can't remember. Anyway, let's count these up. How many did we find? So amp, well, with all of these different amp modules and different settings and different cabs that we can use and all the different microphone and placements, yeah, there's a lot there. Okay, it's one plugin, but there's a lot of options. The same thing with the pedal board. There are a lot of different distortion units, pedals in this one plugin, and the fact that we can add other pedals on top, delay pedals or whatever else it might be, that gives us a lot of options. But we'll call that, so we're up to 2. Okay, now we've got the tape delay. Maybe slightly surprising to some of you that this adds some distortion, some saturation. So with 3, a limiter 4, and I suppose you've got 2 types of limiters. We'll call it 1. So what's that? 4. Compressor 5. The vintage EQs. Well, there's 3 different vintage EQs. Do we include those? All right, we'll just call that 1. We'll call that 1. So it's 6. The auto filter 7. We've got the Evoc 20 filter bank. That's 8. Fuzzwire 9. Spectral gate 10. Fat effects 11, even though there's different distortion modules within that, so there's a lot of options again. Space Designer, what are we up to now? 12. Exciter 13. So that's 13 distortion plugins, not including the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 distortion plugins in the distortion folder. So what's that? 19. So that's not bad. And there may be other ways that you can use some of the other plugins, maybe stacking multiple instances of these plugins on top of one another to create some interesting artifacts that might border on distortion. So there we go. That is some of the plugins in Logic that you may not have thought of as being distortion plugins, but nonetheless can be used to saturate, harmonically excite, or distort your audio and other source material. I think that's really interesting that there are that many options, particularly useful when sound designing, maybe not so much the case when mixing, but definitely for sound design. It's definitely worth checking out some of these plugins, try and push them in weird kind of ways and see what comes out. As I said before, it's all about the happy accidents. Thank you guys for joining me on this one. I hope you've got something out of it, and I hope that whatever you're doing, you're inspired to go and create something and you're having a wonderful time doing it. Until the next time, peace out, and I'll see you again real soon. Take care.